The question is, am I otaku? Short answer, no. Long answer, this is going to take a while. Let me start with my own personal history. I grew up like most children in the first world in the 1980s, and a large number in the third world with cartoons. I watched cartoons every day. I also grew up in a culture that said live action may or may not be for adults, but cartoons are always for kids. No explanation for why this is the case, just that it's something everyone knew. When I was a little filly, a galloping blaze overtook my... Wait, I'm sorry, I've got something mixed up there. When I was 5 years old or so, there's a pregnant girl that sat me down for about an hour to convince me not to watch cartoons anymore. She particularly hated things to do with ducks, apparently. She really hated ducks. Part of her long rant involved how ducks were the dumbest creatures on Earth, and not understanding why anyone would want to watch something about ducks. This shook me up at that fragile age. Even though I'd be the only one around my age who did so, I wanted to like what was grown up and not stupid things, so I decided to swear off cartoons. This lasted, well, maybe about half a year. My mom gave all of our cartoons to my sister, who was married with her own children, some of whom were my age. Actually, all of them were about my age. Being the only kid in my class who didn't watch cartoons, though, took its toll, and I eventually gave up on my crusade against cartoons. What's more, I realized as I got older that her arguments didn't really hold much weight. She basically hated something and had no logic backing her up. By the time I was 13 or 14, while most kids my age were abandoning cartoons because they were desperate to grow up, before the inevitable nostalgia phase hit, which is so common with baby boomers and Gen Xers, I'd already given up on and then reclaimed cartoons. Even so, while there were things that I liked, I was hoping they would grow up with me. And of course, to a 14-year-old church-raised boy entering puberty, that meant boobies and bad work. Seriously though, when we moved away from our big house into our little mobile, and I finally had kids in my neighborhood to play with, I also got, along with that, a TV of my own, not to mention my own room. I got the Sci-Fi Channel about that time and I loved it. There were always cheesy old sci-fi movies to watch, as well as some TV shows, but one thing I was able to do was watch late at night, since my bedroom was on the other side of the house from my parents. And I saw this animated movie around midnight that I don't remember much about, except that it involved, this is a TV Tropes thing they call a Zeroth Law Rebellion plotline, where the robots were wiping out humanity to protect the environment. The only thing that really stood out to me was that they used words like damn and hell. Ooh, damn and hell. As time went on, my friends got an anime collection being sold on the Sci-Fi Channel, including things like Akira, Record of Lodoss War, Project A-ko, Golgo 13, and Ninja Scroll. In general, it was all adult-oriented anime, even though Project A-ko was very, very silly and not very mature. I found out that Sci-Fi was playing anime regularly, and it took me a while to find when it was scheduled, but I started watching and recording anime there. I saw the Tenchi movie, which I didn't understand at all until I saw the OVA series, Urusei Yatsura 2, and a few others before my friends invited me to watch their movies. As I had never seen an R-rated movie all the way through, I found Akira to be completely disturbing. I closed my eyes all the time during the showing of that movie, and yeah, I almost completely gave up on anime after that because I didn't want to see anything that violent ever again in my life. But they convinced me to watch Project A-ko after that, and I changed my mind about it. I bought my first anime VHS tape at summer camp that year, which was Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals. Absolutely horrid. But I kind of liked it at the time. It was kind of funny. It's very juvenile humor. But you know, my friends and I started gathering a small collection. Primarily them, not me, because I didn't have the money to do this kind of stuff. But we got Tenshi Muyo, Urusei Yatsura, and Macross Plus. It was all very strange and fascinating, but I didn't really get into it deep until I started downloading a bunch of Super Nintendo ROMs and discovered a Sailor Moon RPG. Here's where everything started to shift. When Sailor Moon first hit TV, I avoided it like the plague. I didn't really need to get into the Power Rangers for the Barbie connoisseur. When I played the game, though, I got kind of interested. I was really into RPGs at the time, and I kind of wanted to know what was going on. Since it was Japanese, I had no idea. My friends had, as I discovered, been watching the show regularly, and they were happy to explain the characters to me. Some incorrectly, because as it turned out, some of the characters in the game weren't actually in the series. First, they brought over a VHS tape that they had taped at the end of Season 1 and the beginning of Season 2, stopping just short of the end of the Doomtree arc. If they'd shown me anything earlier in the series, I probably wouldn't have gotten hooked on it. It had something, at least in that point in the series, that other cartoons did not have, and that was strong-ish continuity. I soon discovered that changes had been made to this series after my friend bought the Doomtree arc on VHS, and I found places that had Sailor Moon episodes for download. I eventually ordered tapes of fan subs from a guy in Canada. I realized that I really liked Sailor Moon, so I found websites with other shows in the same broad umbrella category of shoujo, which is really girls, which means all the stuff that I was watching was made for girls. And that's when I discovered Kodocha. Kodocha. Actually, the anime version, not the manga. Around the same time, I found Martian successor Nadesco. Much like MASH, both of these shows took silly comedy and switched it to tragedy in the blink of an eye. In addition to having, well, especially Kodocha, incredible continuity, at least for the first 20 episodes or so. I found out that the continuity kind of broke apart after the 20th episode of Kodocha. This is about the time I graduated high school, and I became obsessed with Japan despite having met maybe 2 non-Filipino Asians in my whole life, and no Japanese people ever. I'm going to get into more detail about that in my Am I Weeaboo video. Because I'll be covering a lot of territory twice, I'll hurry up and say that the beginning of my waning obsession with anime came when my family moved to Azusa. I started classes at Citrus College, nothing moving towards degrees unfortunately, and took my first official Japanese class. Probably just to get an easy A and earn credits and keep an academic visa while working full-time to support themselves, a good half of the class were Japanese. While there, someone was handing out flyers to a showing of something called the Golden Laws. I looked at the flyers and said I might go see it, when one of my Japanese classmates came up to me and said, "Don't go, it's a cult." He invited me instead to Japanese fellowship at APU. This will be covered in my Am I Weeaboo video too, but spending time there at Japanese fellowship on and off over the next few years would be eye-opening to me about a lot of things. One of the things that I discovered was that people like me, who were really into anime and games, were less appreciated in Japan than they were in the US. This was the start of the deterioration of my obsession, to the point where right now I almost never watch anime. And the only manga I read is Naruto, which I read for 5 minutes a week just so I can see how the dumb story ends. This is where things get confusing for people, for a lot of people, especially a lot of current anime fans, particularly if they're in their teens. Why would so many Japanese people be hostile to anime fans? I think this requires some understanding of the underlying factors, of course. So let's talk about the history of anime. When modern anime came around, I say modern, meaning Tezuka started modern anime. Before that, it was all propaganda stuff and just some little experiments that people did with animation that never really got anywhere. His anime were made for children in much the same way that American cartoons were. This is slightly in contrast to comic books in Japan, which were the realm of young boys in America, but there was something for pretty much everyone in Japan. However, while American comics were on relatively high-quality paper, and they were saved and reread, in Japan it was made on the cheapest possible paper and made to be disposed of. Comics were a quick, disposable diversion, even if they were technically made for everyone. Animation, by contrast, takes a lot of money to make, or at least it did back then. It meant a lot more skill and coordination than comics. Coordination of people, not coordination of body. And as kids that grew up on Astro Boy and Kimba, or Tetsuon Atom and Janguru Taite, grew up, they got introduced to more teen-friendly shows like Gundam, and even things like Urusei Yatsura. The silly adventures of a horny teenage boy may have actually been directed at kids originally, because the point was that they're supposed to look at this silly teenage boy who's doing all these things to chase after the girls and make fun of him for doing it, you know, because those girls obviously have cooties. But I don't know if they really realized that it also had the draw with that very same demographic of horny teenage boys. And that, combined with things like Gundam, kept some of these kids, not all of them, but some of them watching anime into their teens and even into adulthood, into their college years. And this is where the first otaku came into existence. Japan is a highly controlled society. People don't express opinions freely. They don't work to change the way things are done. They don't do these things, not because it's illegal, because it's not. Japan is a completely free country, legally speaking, just like America. I mean, we basically wrote their constitution. It's socially is the reason why they don't do these things. In Japan, you really do not want to be considered a deviant of society, much more than a country like the US or even, Western European countries. These aging cartoon fans, while their compatriots were abandoning them to grow up, in quotes, they decided, much like I did, that there was nothing grown up about throwing away the things that you love. In America, people look at you weird for doing things like that. In Japan, it's much worse than that. If you haven't had significant experience with the shame culture, which is what most East Asian countries are, as opposed to a guilt culture like the United States, which punishes wrongdoing primarily through fines and jail time, you probably wouldn't understand, but these geeks were outcasts in Japan far worse than they've ever been in the US. To make things worse, in the late 80s, a man named Tomo Miyazaki kidnapped, sexually abused, mutilated, and murdered 4 young girls. Before he was caught, the killings were known as the Little Girl Killings. After they raided his apartment, however, in 1989, they found a lot of anime, horror movies, a movie about torture, and a lot of violent pornography. Of course, horror stories and porn have always been a part of Japanese culture to some extent, so the scapegoat that they latched onto was his love of primarily pornographic, though they ignored that detail, anime, and he became known as the Otaku killer. So now in Japan, not only are otaku still outcasts, they are also regular scapegoats for violent crime. In addition to foreigners. In 2008, a man posted on 2chan, a popular message board that was especially popular with otaku. In fact, it's the first web-based message board in existence, known primarily for the ability that people have to post anonymously. But he posted that he would murder people in Akihabara, a place that otaku love to hang out. Because he posted on 2chan, and it took place in Akihabara, the Japanese media labeled him an otaku, even though he actually murdered otaku and did it out of spite for his girlfriend breaking up with him. So no, I don't consider myself an otaku anymore. I've kind of gotten used to the repetition in anime now. What was once strange and exotic is now often very played out. And there's a lot of good shows and movies out there, don't get me wrong, but I don't foam at the mouth with excitement at the chance to see some random anime anymore. Even so, I would still be considered an otaku in Japan. That means that in addition to the distrust I'd be shown by at least some people, and eventually, for being foreign, I'd be shown even more for being otaku, even though I'm really not. The US, on the other hand, went through a shift in the 90s where nerds became more accepted because nerds were the ones that gravitated towards computers. And we became very useful by the start of the 21st century. That means the kind of things that nerds liked also rose, ever so slowly, in popularity. There's a reason that Dark Knight, Spider-Man, and Iron Man are some of the best-selling movies of all time. A transition like that never happened in Japan. It was always understood, at least since the late 60s, that Japan needed to become more cutting-edge with technology if they were ever going to survive. There was never a need to look up to otaku, who didn't tend to be all that good with computers anyhow. Combined with the controlling nature of a shame-based punishment culture, Japan is not, and likely never will be, the haven for geeks that a lot of Westerners think it is. So there you go. I'm still relatively into video games. I still like animation, not exclusively Japanese. I like a lot of Western animation too, and I'll get into some of that later. But yeah, this is the issue with labels: is that humans like to strip things down to their essentials, but their essentials are often very complex and a lot more than they really think they are. This is one of the problems with politics. This is one of the problems with social movements in general, but there's time for that later.